Okay, so welcome everyone to episode 4 of this Facebook Live series where Dr. Steele and Newton will be discussing the topic tonight, rest and resistance through embodied healing. So I will begin by introducing myself. My name is Tatyana Smith, and I'm going to be the moderator for our conversation this evening. So I am a counseling psychology doctoral student at Western Michigan University. I'm also a therapist in the Counseling Center at Kalamazoo College, where I primarily work with students of color. So in honor of tonight's topic, I wanted to start first by sharing some of the ways that I rest and engage in embodied healing practices. So for me, this includes many things. So burning candles, eating soul food, engaging in West African drum and dance. And I want to shout out the Rooted Enrichment Center here in Kalamazoo. I also engage in embodied healing through music, clothing, media. I'm really enjoying watching the new season of a Black Lady sketch show, and also listening to the psychotherapy podcast with Dr. Afia. I also like art, prayer, sleeping, traveling, and just spending time in nature and in Black communities. And I find that I feel the most rested and healed when I'm interconnected with others. So next, to introduce Dr. Sharmika Newton, she is a psychologist and director/owner of the Legacy Mental Health Services, PLC. She is also an author, coach, and DEI speaker, and an assistant professor at the University of North Dakota. Dr. Newton is experienced in multiculturalism and in training leaders and mental health professionals in building strong teams that are culturally informed. Furthermore, she is a strong believer in the use of rest and embodied healing practices. Some of her favorite embodied healing practices are dancing off beat, which she'll explain later, listening to upbeat music, and sitting in her living room by herself at night, just embracing the silence and the stillness of the day. She also engages in soul care by giving to others because one of her greatest joys in life comes from empowering others. Next, to introduce Dr. Janeé Steele, she is a licensed professional counselor and counselor educator at Walden University. Dr. Steele is also the owner and clinical director of Kalamazoo Cognitive and Behavioral Therapy, PLLC. She's certified in cognitive behavioral therapy through the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies, where she is also a new member of their board of directors and an original member of the Diversity Action Committee. Right now, her favorite ways to rest are watching K-dramas with her husband, reading young adult fantasy books. So her current reads are Tristan Strong Destroys the World and Children of Virtue and Vengeance. She also enjoys taking walks in nature and, of course, sleeping. She believes that giving herself permission to stop and just enjoy the beauty of all that God has created helps her, and it also helps others in her life give themselves permission to do the same. So this evening, we'll be talking about rest, its potential for liberation, and how we can achieve it through embodied healing. And we want to recognize that conversations about the issues that contribute to a lack of rest and the need for liberation in our lives can be painful. With that in mind, we always like to begin with a reminder about the importance of self-care and mindfulness during our time together. So if you are a target of oppression, be aware of anything that might be overwhelming, use mindfulness and breathing skills when you need to, and take a break if necessary. If you are an ally or a learner, work toward maintaining a non-judgmental stance, recognize any defensiveness you may be experiencing, and listen with the intention of understanding and learning. And we also invite you to apply the embodied healing principles we'll discuss this evening. So with that said, we'll get started. So my first question for you all is, what is embodied healing? How would you define that for our audience?
I tend to think about embodied healing as body-centric strategies that we implement to enhance our coping. So in therapy, embodied healing is used often to manage our responses to stress, especially traumatic stress. For example, when we're talking about racial trauma, individuals who have experienced race-based stress tend to develop symptoms such as hypervigilance or constantly being on guard. They may even develop an exaggerated startle response, and they may develop somatic complaints like they might start getting headaches and stomach aches, hyperventilating, muscle tension. And so because those symptoms are experienced in our bodies, we experience stress in our bodies, the way that we can deal most effectively with stress is through discharging that energy from our bodies. And that's how I like to think about embodied healing.
Yeah, when I was just thinking about what Dr. Steele just shared, it really is, it's cultivating a sense of like inner security or inner peace, because our body, it does track like the injuries or the stress that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And that can be race-based stress, or that can also just be stress just from life in general. And so it's cultivating an inner peace within the individual. And it can look different, I think, for different people based off of your personality. Um, you can use movement or meditation or the use of your senses. When Tatyana introduced me, I had in there, and I said I would explain a little bit later, dancing off beat. For me, dancing off beat produces like that inner freedom or free feeling within myself. And because I don't have rhythm, it's often offbeat. And so just the use of dance for myself. So I think it can look different from each individual, but it leads to just that awareness also of your inner self and that calming of the inner individual.
Mhm. And something that stands out for me and what you just said, Dr. Char, is Resmaa Menakem's kind of 5-part process that describes embodied healing. And so he really thinks about it as first soothing ourselves, right? Like noticing when we're experiencing stress and psychological just stress. And then noticing specifically where in our bodies we're experiencing that. Is our chest hurting? Are our muscles tight? Are we having difficulty breathing? And then once we notice where that's happening for us, just working toward accepting it rather than attempting to flee from it. And then, as I said, working toward safely discharging that energy through the various practices that we've already begun to talk about today. They might be unique to you as an individual. Like if you like I like to watch K-dramas, or I like to read young adult fiction, or they may be things that have been found through research to be effective, things like breathing, deep breathing, relaxation exercises.
Yeah, so kind of what I'm hearing from the both of you is that not only does embodied healing represent a way for us to heal and find like that liberation and freedom through our bodies, because as Dr. Newton was just talking about, like the body keeps score of like our wounds and injuries. It's also a way for us to like find happiness. I mean, because there's happiness and healing. And that kind of what you both share kind of connects to how I also think about embodied healing. And that, you know, it represents a form of soul care for BIPOC folks, because these practices allow us to honor our whole selves. So our bodies, our minds, our spirits, our hearts, and our communities. So it may seem obvious to some, but how would you both define rest?
I think for me, rest is it's closing out the busyness of your day, right? Because a lot of times, many of us are wearing multiple hats. Maybe we're serving the community or with work, or with family. And I think for me, rest is just closing out that busyness and allowing your mind just to really be in the here and now and focus in on whatever it is, if it's going for that walk or if it's, sipping some hot chocolate. It's just being in the present moment with yourself versus kind of always being busy and on the go and meeting the demands that are placed upon us. And I think it's also a part of it's a way in which we allow our bodies to reset themselves, to kind of to reset, restart, and move forward with whatever challenges we have coming next.
Mhm. And for me, you know, how I'm thinking about rest currently is really influenced by the work of Tricia Hersey, who has popularized this idea about rest being a form of resistance through her idea she calls the NAP ministry, and then also through her book, Rest is Resistance. And in that book, she talks about rest being a spiritual practice that encourages us to slow down without feeling guilt or shame. And for me, like that's the key part of rest, is to be able to feel at peace when I'm not doing anything. Me personally, I used to feel so guilty when I wasn't doing work. If I would just sit down and watch TV, I would just talk to myself about how I was wasting time. And there are so many more other things I could be doing that would be valuable. And it was actually a woman at my church. She said, when I'm sitting down watching TV, and I, viewed her as a successful person. So I said, wait, you watch TV? And she was like, girl, yes, sometimes you just have to rest. And so like that idea was so freeing for me, because so many of the messages, and this was actually when I was a doctoral student. So we all know what that's like. We here today know what that's like. It was constant go, 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 go. And those were the messages that were kind of like drove into us. And to hear somebody say that rest is kind of like a divine right was so revelatory for me.
Yeah, and I think you saying that, it reminds me of something I saw. It said something along the lines of, she thought she could do it, and you would think she could, but then she just decided to rest. And I think it's, when I think about rest, it's also that ideal of just setting boundaries with yourself, that giving, like you were saying, Dr. Janeé, just giving yourself permission to just, maybe you can do it, maybe you can take on the world right now, but maybe you just need to chill. And it's being okay with just that, being in chill mode sometimes, to in our common day vernacular. So
Yeah, and I love that you connected, Dr. Steele, this idea of rest with our like internal emotional experience. And I feel like that's so relevant, what you were talking about, that need to like always be productive and worrying about how are we utilizing our time is so relevant for Black women. I feel like in particular, just because of like being, these high functioning Black women in these professional spaces, and the messages that we get from people in those spaces, and also society about like how we should be spending our time. And I also like what you were talking about, Dr. Newton, of like, it's really about like taking that time to slow down and connect with our mind and body and honoring where we are in the present moment, like not thinking about the next thing. I know that is something that I personally like struggle with. And it is about being intentional to kind of like, I think, like as my generation would say, like practice living the soft Black girl life. And like that's a part of like that's a part of our self-love and our divine right. So I really appreciate what both of you shared to that point. So kind of continuing along those lines, what would you say are the relationships among rest, resistance, and embodied healing? And how do these practices lead to our liberation?
I think, continuing with Tricia Hersey's work, she talks about rest being resistance against capitalism and white supremacy specifically. Capitalism because it encourages us to work to the point of exhaustion in order to obtain goods. And then white supremacy because for people of color, particularly, our worth is determined often by our ability to produce labor. Beyond that, just other, more common aspects of white culture that might be more ubiquitous, things like individualism and competition and meritocracy, or the belief that if we work hard enough, then we'll get what we deserve, which doesn't take into account like societal structures, whether that be, related to racism or poverty or any other form of oppression that might influence the outcome of the work that we produce. So when we rest, we rail against like those ideologies by saying like, my value isn't in my worth, or my value, my worth isn't in my ability to produce labor, but I'm valuable just because I exist and I can rest, and that's okay.
yeah, and kind of in line with that, in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he talks about the ideal of self-consciousness, and that's part of the liberation process, is that we can't do that self-conscious work if we're always busy, like working for a capitalistic society, or if we're just always busy, just doing whatever. We don't have that time to really do that self-reflection or introspection work, to really engage in that self-consciousness or that self-awareness, to be able to, create change within ourselves, and then change within, society overall. And so I think that's, the connection that I see with liberation, being liberated, and then also, just resting is part of that, building our self-care and that self-awareness, that I think is just embedded within that. framework.
Mm-hmm. And then I think something that stands out for me in terms of what both Dr. Char and Tatyana, both of you have said tonight, is that if we're constantly working within like this kind of grind, hustle, individualism mindset, we're not as focused on our connections with others. We're not as focused on our connections with our families, with our communities, with God. And when we're disconnected from those things, at least from an African-centered perspective, we're not really truly like embodying our true selves.
I definitely agree with that, Dr. Steele. And I think because we've been talking about Tricia Hersey so much, there is kind of like a quote that I took from her that I think is fitting for what we were talking about, like the fact that rest and resistance and body healing is like she keeps repeating, this is more than it just being about naps. Like it's really her battle cry and her mantra. And I really love what she said about rest, in particular as Black women. We are Black women, you know, talking about this tonight. In America, suffering from generational exhaustion and racial trauma, rest and liberation and this resistance is a way that we can honor like our political refusal and the social justice that's uprising like within our bodies. Taking rest and naps in a way of like slowing down is honestly a way to save our lives. Think about so many of us that put ourselves in the hospital because we ignore all these signs that we're getting from our body saying, hey, lady, I need rest. Like we need to slow down. That's so real. And to the piece about it being a source of liberation, thinking about our ancestors who had that time to rest stolen from them and not being able to dream in that way so that we can create the changes that we want to see. So just like you said, pushing back on those narratives, this idea that we are just producers, we're laborers, and not finding our value and worth in that. I think all of that is so important. So how would you say for those that are listening tonight that they could practice rest and other forms of embodied healing in their everyday lives?
Well, Dr. Newton and I recently published a book, which is available for purchase on Amazon, called Black Lives Are Beautiful, 50 Tools to Heal from Trauma and Promote Positive Racial Identity. And in activity 5 of that book, we talk a lot about various embodied healing practices that one could utilize for this purpose. And so in that activity, some of the things we talk about are things like body scan, engaging your senses, deep breathing, relaxation, and even meditation. And so I think those are some really good foundational kind of like evidence-based strategies that we could use. But of course, like we've been talking about tonight, each person should do what works for them. So I like to go on walks and I like to watch certain things and I like to just be by myself as opposed to being with other people. You know, those things give me a sense of peace and a sense of calm and they allow me to recharge. And so for me, those can become embodied healing practices because they do just that. They provide a source of healing and coping for me.
Yeah, I like that piece about doing what is fitting for you. I think that's so important. In the book, Black Lives Are Beautiful, we also talk about like the use of music. So if you go back to like, you know, just our history, slavery, one thing they couldn't take away from us was music, right? The Negro spirituals that, and just song. So using music as a way to engage in these practices, I think is important. One thing, one strategy or tool we use in the book is creating a playlist. So your playlist, it may be all rap music, right? Or it may be jazz, or it may be spiritual or gospel music, but create a playlist of songs that you can use and maybe use those songs while you're, you know, resting or while you're lighting a candle or going for a walk in nature. So that's something that you can kind of personalize to yourself as well. I think is also the power in music would be one that I would say is a way.
Mm-hmm. And I think, to coincide with these body-centric practices, adopting cognitive approaches can also like supplement and enhance our use of them. I was thinking when you were talking about creating a playlist, how like much compassion and self-acceptance and recognizing that we always continue to grow can help us in this process too, because my playlist used to consist of songs like all I do is win, 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 no matter what. And every day I'm hustling, right? Like all of the messages that are exactly opposite of what we're talking about today, because they kind of pumped me up to do more work. So when we're thinking about, music, it's important to recognize that it can have positive or neutral or even negative effects on like our mindsets and how we treat ourselves. So sometimes things like sound good, but it's also important to really think seriously about the messages that we're receiving through music. And is it something that's going to support me? Is it something that is encouraging me to care for my soul and the way I think about myself and the way I think about my relationships with other people?
Yeah, I'm loving all of the gems that you both are dropping with this question. Because it takes practice and it requires us to be intentional to resist and to go against the grain and go against all of these messages that we're constantly being hit with every single day and trying not to internalize them. And I love the piece about music. I'm a big person with music as well. Another thing that I would add that is like personally helpful for me, like if you're a person that's like visual and you need to see it, to the piece that you were speaking about, Dr. Steele, about these cognitive approaches to embodied healing, I think about words of affirmation. So making those specific to our rest and our healing and our resistance in the relationship among those. Recently, I like put up a whole bunch of words of affirmation around my bathroom, and that really does something for me because I know that I'm going to go to my bathroom every single day. I'm going to turn on that light and I'm going to see the wall, and I'll pick out an affirmation or two to like read myself and like help me get to the day. It's soothing. In my house in general, like everywhere, I have like cues to remind me to slow down and appreciate the stillness that Dr. Newton was talking about earlier, to be gentle with myself, to be patient with myself and my body. So that can be another helpful tool for others as well that are more visual.
Mm-hmm. And I think your point about intentionality is really important because yes, we can and should use these strategies when our needs are immediate. So if we're stressed out and like we can feel our blood pressure rising or we can feel our heart beating, like it's great to pause and to take a breath or to stretch or to take a walk. But it's also really important that we're intentional in implementing these strategies when we're not under immediate distress, because it's so much more difficult to do it if we haven't practiced. So practicing affirming yourself, even when you're not engaging actively in negative self-talk, or practicing taking some deep breaths, even when you're breathing just fine. Those again, practices are really what provide the long-term ability for us to cope.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think it's just that the power of being intentional about it, that even if you're not saying in crisis or you may not, feel that you need to do it, like just getting in the practice, I think is important. And I have something that's called like the 15-minute rule. It's just do it for 15 minutes. So then it becomes more automatic with your practice and more automatic to go to when you are feeling the need to rest. And when you need to rest, it's just a common practice for your life.
Mm-hmm. Because the reality of this is because of how we're socialized, a lot of it's not going to come natural. If we're, socialized to be on the go and to constantly be grinding, it's going to feel really strange and maybe even uncomfortable for us to slow down and rest. And so if we're not practicing, we're not able to get our bodies to a place where it's even having the intended effect that we're hoping for.
I love that you just said that too, Dr. Steele, because that that being uncomfortable, and even for some folks might feel threatening, slowing down and really taking the time to check in with ourselves is even more of an indicator like, ooh, something is going on here. Like I do need to spend more time like checking in with ourselves as opposed to doing what we're normally socialized to do, you know, in a capitalist society, which is to ignore, you know, to build a bridge and get over things, to just keep working. It'll work itself out eventually. I think that's really important messaging to get out there.
Yeah, because we've talked about like capitalism and white supremacy, but our own life experiences also influence what our ability to rest is like. I know for myself, just because where I grew up, like it was kind of dangerous to be a woman. Like men were very threatening in my, at least from my perception in my community. And so even like now, if I close my eyes to do breath work or muscle relaxation, that kind of induces panic because I feel unsafe because I can't see what's going on around me. And so for me, like sometimes I got to take those breaths with my eyes open, or I have to talk to myself about my safety before I engage in the actual exercise or practice, because that's just where life has landed me personally. So again, that's where those cognitive pieces can come in if that kind of pre-work is necessary to being able to implement these body-centric strategies for ourselves.
And I think as we're talking, this connects back to our episode 3, which was the superwoman syndrome, the messages that we give to ourselves, like, is it okay? Or in some situations, is it even safe to rest? Because, like Dr. Janeé was saying, will something bad happen, or the threat of something bad? And so I think it's reworking. That's where the cognitive piece comes into play, where we're thinking about our thoughts, and we're also engaging in the practices at a level that feel comfortable for us, and building upon that as we move forward.
And especially for women and Black women in particular, you know, these practices allow us to take back our power, you know, from being overwhelmed by our stress, by our anxiety, by our experiences of PTSD and racial trauma. Yeah. So as we begin to wrap up the conversation, I do want to take the time to make sure that we don't have any questions in the comments from folks that are watching that we can answer.
We had a really great suggestion for something that could be a healing practice from Holly, which was gardening and painting. And I think that gardening is an excellent point. To my surprise, this summer, I realized that pulling weeds is actually the most mindful activity I've ever been engaged in my life. Like I was out there for at least an hour before I realized I had not thought about anything else but these weeds that I had been pulling. And so that's a really great example of how everyday things can become like sources of relaxation and peace for us.
Mm-hmm. And I think about how, from just like you were talking about earlier, Dr. Steele, from an Afrocentric perspective, how being grounded and rooted and connected with the earth through the act of pulling up those weeds can be healing, especially for Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if there are no other questions or comments, Drs. Newton and Steele would like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And of course, if you are interested in learning more, please check out their book, which they've already shouted out for us, Black Lives Are Beautiful, 50 Tools to Heal from Trauma and Promote Positive Racial Identity, which you can find on Amazon.
Thank you, Tatyana, for another great conversation tonight.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you both for the conversation.
All right, and we hope to see everybody back next month. Thank you all for who joined us live and who will listen in the future.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.